They were supposed to be warriors, silent, obedient, devout, men who fought and died for the cross. But somewhere hidden behind the walls of a chapel in southern France, someone found something they weren't meant to see. A manuscript, faded, fragmented, but unmistakable. It spoke of Christ, but not the one from the pulpit. This was a different Messiah, one who didn't die for sin, who didn't beg for followers, and who never claimed a throne. The Church called it heresy. The Templars, it seemed, called it truth. And if this gospel truly existed, if they really hid it, then history isn't just wrong. It's been deliberately rewritten. Now breathe. Let the fire and whispers settle. The walls around you are thick with silence. You're not in a cathedral. You're inside a secret. And it's been waiting for centuries to be heard again. So let's begin where all good stories begin, not with answers, but with questions. Who were the Knights Templar really? Why did they rise with lightning speed and fall just as suddenly? And what was so dangerous, so earth-shattering, that the most powerful religious institution in Europe decided it had to be buried? Twice you're about to enter the forgotten corridors of this mystery. You'll walk through crypts, libraries, trial records, and whispered rumors passed down by firelight. You'll see not just what the Templars fought for, but what they read, believed, and maybe even died to protect. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. It begins with a priest and a shovel. In 1898, Father Béranger Saunière was renovating the altar of his crumbling church in Rennes-le-Château, a sleepy hilltop village in southern France. He wasn't searching for treasure. Not exactly. But beneath the flagstones hidden inside a hollow Visigothic pillar, he found a collection of parchments that would set off over a century of rumor, speculation, and suspicion. Most historians dismissed them as genealogical records, mundane documents tied to local noble families. But the handwriting, the seals, and the curious inclusion of Latin scripture written with Gnostic undertones told another story. One page, badly damaged, contained a phrase that stood out: "The word is not bound by the flesh." It didn't come from any known gospel. And Saunière, who once struggled for parish funds, suddenly had access to enormous wealth. Today, Rennes-le-Château is draped in conspiracy and half-truth. But strip away the tourist plaques and souvenir shops, and you're left with something far stranger. A priest with ties to secret societies. A flurry of coded inscriptions carved into the church's architecture after his discovery. A painting of Christ with a cryptic Latin riddle at its base. And most curiously of all reports, that Saunière received visitors from the Vatican men who traveled not for confession, but for negotiation. The connection to the Templars was not immediate. It was subtle. The documents found bore no red crosses, no knightly seals. But in the foundation of the church garden, Saunière unearthed something else, a carved stone bearing the faded imprint of a Templar 8-pointed star. Weathered and cracked, but unmistakable. The symbol had no reason to be there. The Templars had been disbanded centuries before the church was built. Unless, of course, the site had older significance, perhaps used before, by those seeking to hide something far more valuable than gold. One particular visitor, an antiquarian named Émile Hoffet, took detailed notes on the discovery. His journal, unearthed decades later, made reference to a booklet of revelations kept hidden beneath the rose. Scholars still debate what he meant, but the phrase "beneath the rose" has long been associated with secrecy rooted in the Latin sub rosa. In Templar architecture, the rose often appears carved in secluded corners beneath staircases, behind altars, or etched into floor tiles near crypt entrances. Hoffet's cryptic comment hinted that whatever Saunière had found was not a mere curiosity. It was part of a tradition, a network of concealment stretching back to the High Middle Ages. One slab in Saunière's garden bore a pattern of grooves resembling a crude map. A few local researchers armed with 19th-century survey tools and a bit of romantic optimism claimed the markings pointed toward Montségur, the last Cathar stronghold and rumored resting place of a trove of heretical writings. Whether that connection held merit or not, what mattered was this. The terrain surrounding Rennes-le-Château had been used, reused, and buried over for generations. The Templars had once passed through this region. Some had even been stationed nearby. A 1245 charter mentions a small commandery operating less than 20 miles away. If they were carrying sacred texts, unorthodox gospels, perhaps they would have needed safe places to store them. Saunière's church may have been built atop one of them. Here's the troubling part. When Saunière died in 1917, he refused to take communion. According to his confessor, the priest was terrified of something beyond the grave. His personal papers were burned. His wealth mysteriously vanished, and a coded message left behind in the village tower written in substitution cipher referenced a gospel beyond salvation. A curious phrase. The Church teaches that no such gospel can exist, and yet the idea of a gospel that speaks not of crucifixion or salvation, but of awakening and inner light begins to appear here, like the first line of a forbidden verse. Modern skeptics argue that all of this could be the result of embellishment, misunderstanding, or even a clever hoax. That Saunière was simply a man with secrets, not a keeper of ancient texts. That Rennes-le-Château is a magnet for fantasy. And yet certain facts remain stubborn. The inscriptions exist. The funds appeared from nowhere, and a map, however crude, was carved into a stone that should never have been there at all. The story's relevance to the Templars only deepens when you consider what came next. In 1904, a local historian published a little red paper suggesting that the documents Saunière found were written in a cipher similar to one used by the Templars during the siege of Acre. He was dismissed at the time, but fragments of the same cipher were later found in archives once belonging to the Order of Christ, in Portugal, the spiritual successor to the Templars. If the cipher matched, then the authorship wasn't just possible, it was probable. Of course, the Church has never publicly commented on the parchments, nor has it acknowledged any connection between the Knights Templar and the discoveries at Rennes-le-Château. But behind closed doors, archival access to Saunière's notes remains highly restricted in Vatican libraries. And when restricted access surrounds something officially dismissed as fiction, the silence begins to speak louder than any proclamation. The village has become a legend. But beneath the myth, beneath the tourist trails and Da Vinci Code echoes, is a trail of very real stone ink and fear. What did Saunière find, and why would a minor priest in a forgotten corner of France risk everything to preserve it? If it was merely a curiosity, the story would have ended with his death. But it didn't. It deepened. Others came searching, and in doing so they began to uncover something that would point backward, centuries backward, to a brotherhood with a different gospel, and a church desperate to keep it buried. They weren't supposed to confess, not fully, not in writing, and certainly not to the Pope himself. But in 1308, under mounting pressure, and with the flames of public heresy accusations licking at their heels, several high-ranking Templars did something unexpected. They told the truth, or at least a version of it. What they revealed was quietly recorded, sealed, and promptly hidden inside the Vatican's darkest vaults for nearly 700 years. The Chinon parchment, as it would later be known, was not a work of fiction. It was real. authenticated, and devastating. Its discovery in 2001 shook the scholarly world. Here was a document signed by Pope Clement V himself, stating that the Templars had been absolved. Not condemned, not excommunicated, absolved. Which begs the question, if the Church forgave them, why were they still burned? The answer may lie not in what they confessed to, but in what they withheld. The chignon parchment, written in elaborate Latin, contains admissions to strange rituals: spitting on a crucifix, kissing on the base of the spine, renouncing Christ aloud during initiations. It reads more like theater than theology, but it was enough to alarm even the most liberal inquisitors. Curiously, however, Pope Clement's document doesn't dwell on punishment. Instead, it recommends penance, prayer, mercy. It's as though he knew these actions were part of something larger, something that couldn't be unpacked in a single interview. The parchment doesn't mention a gospel, not directly. But there is a moment almost glossed over when a knight named Geoffroy de Gonneville hesitates. He's asked about texts. He pauses. And then he says this: there are writings which are not for the eyes of the unprepared. The inquisitors move on. The line is buried in legalese, but it remains a crack in the wall. This kind of phrase would be easy to dismiss as metaphor, until you recall that by this point, the Templars were rumored to maintain libraries in Cyprus Acre and southern France. Their scribes were literate in Latin, Greek, and Arabic. They had access to Byzantine theological debates, Islamic mysticism, and apocryphal Christian writings. The odds of them possessing an unorthodox gospel, whether Gnostic, Essene, or entirely their own, were not insignificant. But where would such a gospel be kept? Not in Paris, where Philip IV's spies had turned the temple fortress inside out. Not in Acre, which had fallen decades before. Some have suggested Chinon itself, a fortress prison on the banks of the Vienne River, might have once served as a storage point. But more likely the text was moved long before the trials began. Hidden within commanderies in remote regions, protected by layers of coded references, oral traditions, and physical concealment. And what of the Pope Clement V? Walked a fine line between loyalty to Philip and loyalty to truth. The Chinon parchment reads like a compromise, offering absolution but withholding full vindication. Some historians believe Clement feared what might be exposed if the Templars were allowed to speak freely. Perhaps he had read or been warned about certain writings in their possession. Writings that questioned not just church authority, but the entire theological foundation of Western Christendom. What's fascinating is the obscurity surrounding the parchment itself. For centuries, it wasn't cited in trials books or canonical histories. It existed only in the Vatican's secret archives, misfiled under the wrong collection number. Was this an accident or a quiet burial? When Italian paleographer Barbara Fraile unearthed it in the early 2000s, the reaction was muted. No grand headlines, no church-wide reckoning. Just quiet acknowledgement followed by a press release so cautious it could have been written in a monastery. But the implications were seismic. The Church had once absolved the Templars, and yet it still allowed them to be erased. Some researchers point to a whisper network within the Vatican figures who knew of the parchment and intentionally let the myth of guilt fester. Because behind that myth was something more dangerous, the idea that the Templars weren't traitors to the faith, but defenders of a parallel one. One with a different origin story, a different purpose, a different gospel. And if they truly possessed such a text, it would explain much of their behavior, their secrecy, their refusal to recant under torture, their cryptic architectural symbols and guarded initiation rites. It would also explain why absolution could never be public, why silence, permanent silence, was preferable to open debate. In one of the parchment's closing lines, the Templars are described as men of the cloth, but not of the fold, an odd phrase even in medieval Latin. Some interpret it as poetic, others as code, as though the Church itself understood that these knights served a truth both close to and dangerously different from its own. And then there's the matter of what happened after the parchment was signed. Clement V did not protect the order. He dissolved it, quietly, officially, and under pressure. The Templars were scattered, their holdings seized, their leaders burned, and yet, the Pope had forgiven them. This contradiction is not just political, it is theological. It opens the door to the possibility that what was being erased was not merely a military order, but a competing gospel, one buried not in sand, but in bureaucracy. We're left with a riddle, a real document signed by a real pope forgiving real men accused of heresy. And yet those men were destroyed anyway. Not for what they did, but perhaps for what they read. You wouldn't think it. Standing there now among the ruins, sun-warmed stones, birds darting between crags, silence humming like a monk's last breath. But Montségur once screamed. It burned too. In 1244, the last defenders of the Cathar faith were dragged from this fortress and set alight by order of the Church. Over 200 souls, branded heretics, died in a mass pyre that lasted hours. Their crime believing in a version of Christianity that had no use for popes, no fear of hell, and no need for crucified salvation. To the Cathars, the material world was a prison, the body a lie. And Christ, he was not sacrificed to redeem flesh, but sent to awaken souls already divine. Sound familiar because that was the rumor. That the Knights Templar, those noble warrior monks, had more in common with these so-called heretics than either side dared admit. And the deeper you dig, the harder it becomes to draw clean lines between them. The Templars and the Cathars never officially collaborated. They didn't fight side by side. They didn't exchange letters sealed with sacred codes. But they did live in proximity geographically and perhaps theologically. Both groups flourished in southern France during the 12th and 13th centuries. Both built fortresses with secret chambers and hidden passages, and both were accused often by the same inquisitors of denying key tenets of Catholic doctrine. The most damning accusation that they possessed or revered alternative scriptures. After the fall of Montségur, chroniclers recorded a strange tale that 4 Cathars escaped down a secret path with a treasure not of gold, but of parchment. A book wrapped in red silk, the account said. Some claim it was the Book of Love, a now lost gospel rumored to teach that Christ never died, but simply left his body. The book vanished from the record, but legends suggest it was given sanctuary. And who in that landscape had the power, secrecy, and motive to hide it? The Templars. A century later, those same themes, spiritual resurrection, inner light, and secret knowledge, reappear in Templar trial transcripts, carved symbols, and encoded texts. Now here's where it gets murky deliciously. Some scholars insist these parallels are coincidental, that the Templars were Orthodox soldiers misunderstood by a suspicious church. But others point out how often the same accusations followed both groups. Denial of the crucifixion, worship of a mysterious head or spiritual force, ritual secrecy, and above all, a refusal to place salvation in the hands of priests. Instead, they placed it in books. Private books, gospels not found in Rome. A notable example, the Cathar text, known as the Book of the Two Principles. It framed the universe as a battle between light and darkness, not God and Satan, but dual creative forces, one of spirit, the other of flesh. It was considered blasphemous naturally. But Templar architectural symbols, particularly the double-headed eagle and the opposing sun-moon carvings in isolated chapels, hint at a similar dualism. Were they merely artistic flourishes or ideological fingerprints? Even their enemies noted the resemblance. Inquisitor Bernard Gui, yes, the same one featured in The Name of the Rose, wrote that some Templars held views dangerously close to the Manichaeans, a label often thrown at Cathars. And in his infamous Practica Inquisitionis, he described interviews where knights spoke of Christ as teacher, not savior, and of the gospel not as history, but as mirror. That last word, mirror, is particularly telling. In Cathar spirituality, divine knowledge was hidden in the self. You didn't need a sermon. You needed a reflection. When you look at the Templar trials, especially those conducted in Languedoc, former Cathar strongholds, you find an unusually high concentration of confessions about non-canonical teachings. Not just heresy, but gospels, fragments, phrases. One knight allegedly referred to the words of the Lightbringer. Another mentioned a scroll without chains. These could be metaphors. They could also be clumsy recollections of a suppressed book passed down among chosen initiates. There's a reason modern researchers keep circling back to this heretical overlap. Because while the Church eventually crushed the Cathars with flame, it needed a more delicate hand for the Templars. These were men with connections, land, gold, secrets. You can't just torch all that without a plan, unless, of course, they were hiding something so potentially devastating that destruction became the only option. Today, Montségur is peaceful again. A ruin, a postcard. Tourists climb its slopes with cameras and day packs, unaware they're tracing the footsteps of martyrs who may have carried fragments of a lost gospel into the shadows. And somewhere along those Pyrenean ridgelines, the Templars waited. If the Cathars did entrust their sacred text to the knights, what happened next? Did it vanish into the folds of the order, re-emerge encoded in chapel art, or disappear into the Templar fleets that sailed from the Languedoc coast before the arrests began? We may never know. But we do know this: two groups accused of the same blasphemies, extinguished by the same hand, and suspected of preserving the same forbidden story, did not simply fade. They echoed, and those echoes they still call from the stone. They swore oaths in darkness, always in darkness, torches flickering, cold stone beneath their knees, no bishops, no witnesses outside the order, only a circle of brothers, a few sacred words, and a ceremony that left inquisitors both scandalized and confused. The Templar initiation rite was never meant to be recorded, but it was dozens of times in testimonies given under torture, whispered in fear, often contradictory and surreal. Yet hidden among the exaggerations and fabrications lies a persistent pattern, a ritual infused with symbols, phrases, and gestures that feel strangely out of place in Orthodox Christianity, almost Gnostic. A typical accusation went like this: a new initiate was brought into a dim room. He was shown a crucifix and ordered to spit on it. Sometimes he was told to deny Christ. Other times he was kissed on the base of the spine, the navel, or the lips. Alone, each act seems bizarre. Taken together, they read like a coded inversion of traditional Christian rites, deliberate provocations meant to signify something deeper, something esoteric. Now let's clear the smoke a bit. These accusations came from men being broken on the rack. Some wanted the pain to stop. Some parroted what inquisitors wanted to hear. But when dozens of testimonies collected across time and geography begin to echo one another, you have to consider the possibility that something real was being remembered, something passed down, not in open doctrine, but in symbol and code. One of the more peculiar testimonies came from a Templar named Jean de Cugy. He described a moment during his initiation when a senior knight whispered to him, "You must die to the flesh to awaken the word." It sounds poetic, harmless. Unless you've read the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, where a similar idea is expressed. Jesus telling his disciples that awakening comes not through suffering, but through knowledge, not through death, but recognition. That phrase alone, the Word, is loaded. In Orthodox teaching, the Word is Christ, the Logos, divine incarnation. But in Gnostic texts, it often refers to a hidden truth, a message that unlocks something within the self. One speaks to worship, the other to transformation. Which one were the Templars truly invoking? Let's add another layer. Several rituals describe the presence of a great head, a mysterious object some knights allegedly venerated. Inquisitors called it Baphomet, a demon, but no one ever found it. No description of it matches another. One witness called it a bearded head. Another said it was metallic, inscribed with lines like a book without pages. Some speculated it was a reliquary, others a mirror. But what if it wasn't a relic at all? What if it was a symbol, an object meant to represent something hidden, perhaps even a gospel known only to the inner circle? Modern scholars have debated the meaning of these rites for years. Were they mystical theater, psychological hazing, or a spiritual code designed to separate those who sought dogma from those who craved something deeper? That last possibility lingers, especially when you consider the widespread presence of Gnostic themes in the regions where the Templars operated. Southern France, northern Spain, outposts in the Levant, where Eastern Christianity and mystical Islam intertwined. One Templar church in Tomar, Portugal, later inherited by the Order of Christ, features carvings of the Ouroboros, the snake eating its tail. It's an ancient symbol of eternal return, often associated with alchemical and Gnostic teachings. It has no place in traditional Catholic iconography, and yet it's there gazing down on the altar like a quiet rebuttal to everything Rome demanded. These details didn't go unnoticed. Pope Clement's own inquisitors were particularly disturbed by the ritual renunciations. They kept asking, why would the knights insult the cross? Why deny Christ? But perhaps they misunderstood the intention. Perhaps it wasn't denial, but redefinition. A ritual death of inherited belief clearing the way for a different kind of truth. Not a rejection of Christ, but of the Church's version of him. It's worth noting that no Templar ever admitted to writing or reading a specific gospel during these rites. That would have been suicidal. But a few did mention sacred phrases not found in common scripture. One such phrase recorded by a scribe in Poitiers was translated as, "The living do not die, they remember." That line, or something uncannily close, appears in the Gospel of Philip, a Gnostic text unearthed at Nag Hammadi in 1945, long after the Templars were gone. Unless, of course, someone kept fragments alive through other means. And here's where things twist. During the trial of the Templar Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, he refused to deny Christ. But he also refused to speak of the rituals. He acknowledged their existence, but called them not for the profane. That phrase, too, comes from a tradition older than the Church. It echoes the Eleusinian mysteries, the Essene scrolls, the initiation rites of early Christian sects who believed truth was not taught, but experienced often through silent symbol and shock. Were the Templars carrying this lineage forward? It would explain the veils, the darkness, the cryptic oaths. It would explain why their rites made so little sense to their enemies, yet remained consistent across centuries. And it would suggest that behind the pageantry stood something more dangerous than heresy, a hidden gospel. One so entwined in their identity that it could only be passed down in ritual, never written, never spoken aloud, only lived. The stones tell stories if you know how to listen. And the Templars were master storytellers, not with pen and parchment, but with mortar, chisel, and light. Across Europe, the order built dozens of churches, commanderies, and round chapels. Many of them still stand today, their walls aged and worn, their secrets half erased by time. But look closer, and something starts to whisper. A pattern, a message, a different kind of scripture, one not written in words, but encoded in design. And perhaps, just perhaps, in that very structure lies evidence of the gospel they could never openly share. Start in London. The Temple Church, consecrated in 1185, is round, not cruciform like most medieval sanctuaries. Its shape mimics the Dome of the Rock, a site deeply venerated by the Templars after their excavations beneath Jerusalem. But more than that, the round form reflects ancient beliefs in cosmic unity, in eternity, in divine cycles. Gnostic thought, particularly Valentinian theology, embraced the circle as a symbol of the aeons, the divine emanations of the unknowable God. The Templars didn't just build round because it was fashionable. They were aligning with something older, stranger, and far less acceptable to Rome. Inside the Temple Church, and others like it, you'll find peculiar motifs: twin columns, serpent patterns, inverted crosses, not as blasphemy, but as symbols of St. Peter's humility, or perhaps as cryptic commentaries on inversion itself, a Gnostic theme. The light in these buildings is intentional. Some Templar chapels are constructed so that on certain days, solstices, equinoxes, a beam of sunlight falls directly onto a carving or alcove, revealing a symbol otherwise hidden in shadow. One scholar described it as illumination by divine appointment. Another called it the architecture of awakening. Then there are the builder's marks, those small, strange glyphs etched by stone masons to identify their work. In Templar sites, these marks are unusually consistent across vast distances. A peculiar fish-shaped curve here, a six-pointed star there. In isolation, they're benign. But when compared across chapels in England, France, Portugal, and the Holy Land, the pattern suggests coordination, or perhaps transmission. Some believe these marks acted as breadcrumbs, mapping a path of sacred knowledge disguised as construction. One particularly curious mark appears in both Tomar, Portugal, and Lyon, France, a triangle enclosing a dot etched discreetly beneath altars. It bears an uncanny resemblance to the ancient Egyptian hieroglyph for inner light, and also mirrors a symbol found in early Christian Gnostic tombs in Alexandria. Could it be coincidence, perhaps? Or perhaps the Templars, through contact with Eastern Christian sects during the Crusades, absorbed more than military tactics. Perhaps they adopted a vision of Christ as light itself, not a savior from without, but a guide from within. And if so, how better to preserve that dangerous idea than in stone, silent, weatherproof, and easily dismissed by the untrained eye? The Church never officially condemned these architectural choices. That's because they didn't see them, or rather didn't understand them. To most clerics, a church was a church, but to the Templars, every angle, every carving, every shaft of light was scripture. Not of Peter or Paul, but of Thomas, Mary, Magdalene, Philip, figures favored in Gnostic writings. Their gospel was carved in limestone, not liturgy. One fresco in a Templar chapel in Metz shows Christ standing not with arms outstretched on a cross, but with one hand touching his chest and the other pointing upward, surrounded by concentric circles. No crown of thorns, no wounds, only serenity. The imagery evokes the gospel of truth, a text lost for centuries and rediscovered in the Nag Hammadi library, in which Christ is portrayed not as a suffering redeemer, but as a revealer of hidden knowledge. It's a gospel without crucifixion, a gospel of awakening. And then there's the rose, The infamous rose window found in many Templar chapels is more than just pretty glass. Sub rosa under the rose has long signified secrecy, hidden knowledge. The window itself, often set high above the nave, filters colored light into patterns that shift with the sun. In some Templar churches, the rose is centered on a star-shaped frame, 8 points radiating outward like compass needles, north, south, east, west, and the 4 directions of spirit. Interpretation optional, but the symbolism is undeniable. If the Bible is a book of words, then these chapels are books of light, read by the initiated, ignored by the rest. And yet, for all their precision, the Templars never left a key. No legend, no codex to explain the meanings. Why? Maybe because the truth was too dangerous. Or maybe because they believed that truth wasn't meant to be taught. It was meant to be experienced. As one anonymous carving proclaims just beneath the pulpit in a ruined Templar chapel in southern Italy, the blind read nothing. The deaf hear the call. So here's the theory. The Templars possessed a gospel. Perhaps not in the traditional sense, not bound in leather or copied on vellum, but etched in geometry, whispered through stone. A gospel made not of pages but of pillars, its message. That truth is not administered through Rome. It is found in the stillness of inner light, and the proof it was hiding in the architecture all along. The mountain seems to float, especially in early morning mist. Montségur rises like a phantom from the Pyrenees, its steep slopes hiding what little remains of the stronghold once called the synagogue of Satan by the Church. But those who perished here in 1244, the last Cathars, believed they were preserving something sacred, something more radiant than stone. And among the stories that cling to this place like moss is one persistent legend that days before the final siege ended, 4 Cathar perfecti escaped through a hidden passage carrying with them not gold, not relics, but scrolls, writings, perhaps even a gospel. The Church feared the Cathars not for their numbers, they were dwindling, but for their ideas. They taught that Christ was not flesh, but light, that the material world was the creation of a lesser power, that salvation was not offered through sacraments, but through knowledge, gnosis. In short, they claimed authority over truth not by hierarchy, but by vision. And that vision was believed to be written down, stored in secret libraries, and passed hand to hand in whispers. So when the fortress fell and the fire consumed the faithful, the Church assumed the writings had burned too. But what if they hadn't? What if the escapees reached allies? What if the scrolls moved silently across mountain passes and ended up in the hands of the only group powerful enough to protect them? The Templars, there is precedent. The Templars operated in the Languedoc region. They maintained commanderies within days' ride of Montségur. And while there is no surviving letter, no receipt marked, "Dear heretics, we'll take your scrolls," there is circumstantial overlap. Not long after the Cathar fall, several Templar properties were fortified further, not against military threat, but for containment. Vaults sealed, chambers walled off. One particularly strange renovation occurred at the Château de Blanchefort, barely 30 miles from Montségur. Its basement was closed, buried, and never reopened, not even during the trial Inquisition. Now here's where things begin to warm with speculation. In 1320, nearly 80 years after the fall of Montségur, and a decade after the Templars had been officially disbanded, an anonymous chronicler in Carcassonne recorded a local rumor that the ghost gospel of the Cathars had survived and was kept among the stones of the warriors of the light. An odd phrase, poetic, but suggestive. Warriors of the Light was never an official name for the Templars, but it certainly fits. And the rumor's persistence was enough to draw attention from Dominican inquisitors, still operating in the region long after the wars had ended. What might these scrolls have contained? Descriptions vary. Some say they were copies of the Book of Love, others that they were fragments from a longer text, the Gospel of the Twin, an apocryphal gospel attributed to Thomas that portrays Jesus as a mystical teacher guiding disciples through inner transformation. Whatever their content, they were consistently described as without suffering, without cross. A gospel that tells a different story. Curiously, years later, a manuscript appeared in the inventory of the Abbey of Orville, once a Templar-friendly site in the Ardennes. It was described as Tractatus Lucis Interioris, Treatise of the Inner Light. The manuscript no longer exists, conveniently lost during a fire in the 18th century. But an 18th century librarian noted in his marginalia that the work echoed the Cathar rejection of sacraments and bore signs of ancient authorship. Could this have been a copy A fragment of one of the Montségur scrolls that found sanctuary through Templar hands? There are also modern complications. In the 20th century, a French researcher named Antonin Gadal claimed to have found fragments of Cathar writings in caves near Montségur. His claims were mostly dismissed romanticism, they said. But some of the symbols he documented, spirals, seven-pointed stars, geometric trees, bear uncanny resemblance to carvings found in later Templar chapels in Portugal. Coincidence, maybe. Or maybe the scrolls were not simply protected, but translated into image geometry and light. A gospel rewritten not in ink, but in design. One piece that cannot be overlooked is the behavior of the Church itself. Inquisitorial records show repeated questions to captured Templars about Cathar contact, not battles, but shared beliefs. This is telling. One would expect questions about military aid alliances or harboring fugitives, but instead the interrogators were obsessed with thought, with doctrine, as if they knew something had passed between the two groups, something invisible but potent. Could this be why the Templars were ultimately targeted? Not just because they were powerful or rich, but because they had inherited a spiritual threat the Church thought it had already extinguished. If the Montségur scrolls truly survived, and if the Templars had protected them, they weren't just housing heresy. They were cradling a gospel that challenged the entire sacramental machinery of Rome. No one has ever produced the scrolls. No complete text has emerged from the caves or the ruins. But the whispers persist. The symbols remain. And every now and then, in a dusty archive or forgotten corner of a church basement, a phrase appears, familiar, luminous, and unplaceable. Perhaps that's how the gospel survives. In fragments, in shadows, carried not in processions, but in footsteps. And as Montségur fades into the horizon, that final campfire of the Cathars still seems to burn less as a funeral pyre and more like a torch passed quietly into waiting hands. They didn't go to Jerusalem for relics. Not really. The story goes that the first Templars, just 9 knights, arrived in the Holy City around 1119 and were granted quarters atop the Temple Mount itself in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. A curious arrangement, especially since the Crusaders had just taken the city and were more interested in guarding territory than handing over prized Islamic sites to a small, untested band of French nobles. But what if the knights hadn't come as warriors at all? What if they had come as seekers, and what if the treasure they were after wasn't gold or even the Ark of the Covenant, but a text? The Temple Mount wasn't just sacred, it was layered. Beneath it lay centuries of debris, hidden chambers, blocked corridors, and the foundations of Solomon's original temple. To some, it was the holiest site in the world. To others, a library turned to stone. Early chroniclers claimed the Templars undertook secret excavations during their years in Jerusalem. No official records exist, how convenient, but sketches from the 18th century show Templar tunnels beneath Al-Aqsa, including one narrow passage nicknamed the Vault of the Scroll. No scroll has ever been found there, of course, or if it was, it didn't stay there long. In 1867, British explorers Charles Warren and Charles Wilson conducted excavations near the southeast corner of the Temple Mount. Their diaries, now preserved in the British Museum, record a strange discovery: a chamber 30 feet below the surface containing fragments of pottery and a carved stone slab inscribed with letters they couldn't read. They were dismissed as Islamic or late Byzantine. But one recent linguistic analysis conducted quietly in 2009 noted that the script may have been a blend Syriac possibly, but with shapes matching early Gnostic graffiti found in Nag Hammadi, which would be odd, because those texts were buried in Egypt. And yet, here was a similar carving beneath the old headquarters of the Templars. And there's more. Around the same time the Templars left Jerusalem, a curious manuscript appeared in Constantinople in the possession of a Byzantine monk named Theophanes of Antioch. He claimed to have been given the text by Western knights, who uncovered it under the House of Solomon. The manuscript, now lost, was described in a letter as a teaching of the light made flesh and contained no mention of crucifixion, resurrection, or sin. Only awakening and breath. The breath of the Christ that lives in all. If this letter is genuine and it has been studied seriously, it could mean the Templars found something profound in Jerusalem and chose to pass it eastward for safekeeping. Why east? Perhaps they knew that Rome would never accept it. Perhaps they hoped the more mystical traditions of Byzantine Christianity might protect it. Or perhaps in true Templar fashion, they created multiple copies and scattered them across friendly lands, hiding them in libraries, monasteries, or even within the very foundations of their own chapels. There's another clue. One that seems like a footnote until you read it 3 times and realize it's not. In a 13th century Templar inventory of objects stored at the commandery in Provence, France, a curious item is listed: Lignum lucis cum notis ignotis, wood of the light with unknown markings. Most assume it refers to a relic, a beam of wood perhaps etched with decorative flourishes. But others argue the phrase with unknown markings is more indicative of script. Letters. Possibly a coded gospel carved into thin wood, a method known from Coptic and Syriac traditions. Easily hidden, easily destroyed, but in the right hands, eternal. Could this be a fragment of what the Templars found beneath Jerusalem? Could they have carved into wood what had once been ink on parchment? If so, it would explain the object's reverence and the vagueness of its description. Label it too clearly, and you invite danger. But describe it as light and unknown, and the trail goes cold. Jerusalem, after all, is the origin of many things. But for the Templars, it may have been the place where their core secret began, not in battle, but in silence. Not in relics, but in revelation. And the fact that they remained in that city for years, with little to show in official records, is in itself suspicious. 9 knights with no new lands, no wealth, no clear accomplishments, and yet they returned to Europe and were granted power privileges and papal favor at breathtaking speed. What did they bring back? Historians like to say it was influence, charisma, connections, maybe even relics passed off as authentic. But the consistency of one rumor that they found writings beneath the temple refuses to die. Muslim historians of the period mention Christian knights behaving strangely at the site, not guarding it, digging, disappearing for hours at a time into underground spaces not open to the public. One chronicler even wrote that the Franks carried out the words of Isa in darkness. That phrase, the words of Isa, is how Muslim writers referred to Jesus' teachings. Not the Gospels we know, but perhaps the ones long hidden. In the end, nothing remains on record. No text, no confirmation, just a legacy of silence and a network of clues so elaborate it almost feels intentional. As if the Templars wanted the world to suspect they'd found something, but not enough to prove it. A gospel buried beneath the most sacred site in Christendom, pulled from the dust by hands that knew what they were looking for. Not a gospel of death, but of light. Not of sin, but of spirit. And if that's true, then what they carried home was not just a scroll. It was a time bomb. One the Church could never afford to let detonate. Two names, two truths. That was the whisper. The idea that the Christ the Templars spoke of in their private councils was not the same Christ depicted in stained glass and crucifixes, that they honored a Jesus of light, not of agony, a revealer of divine origin, not a redeemer by blood. This wasn't blasphemy in the usual sense, it was more subtle, more dangerous. Because if the Church's Jesus was the Son of God sent to die, then the Templars' Jesus was sent to awaken. This dual belief theory isn't modern. It first appeared during the trials hinted at by interrogators who couldn't quite understand what they were hearing. Some Templars, when pushed, described their Christ as the invisible one, the light-bringer, or the one who does not suffer. Others called him the twin or the guide. These weren't flippant metaphors. They matched language used in the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Judas, and Pistis Sophia, all texts in which Jesus isn't so much sacrificed as he is hidden. And in these writings, the greatest sin isn't disobedience, it's ignorance. The Templars were, of course, trained in Orthodox doctrine. They could recite the Nicene Creed like any other monk. But the dual belief theory suggests that this was a surface layer, a public faith for the world to see, and a private gospel for those within. An inner circle, a deeper initiation. Much like the ancient mystery religions of Greece and Egypt, the Templar path may have involved layers of understanding, and Christ, rather than being a final destination, was a mirror pointing inward. One clue to this can be found in the chapel at Rosslyn, long associated perhaps too romantically with the Templars. There, among elaborate carvings of plants, stars, and angels, is a single face, serene, unmarked, floating in light. No wounds, no crown, no sorrow, just presence. Some believe it represents a Gnostic Christ, the Logos, as clarity, not martyrdom. And what's carved around him, grapes, vines, and a figure touching his chest, as if listening for something not spoken. Theological scholars have long debated how far the Templars strayed from orthodoxy. Many insist they remained within bounds, citing their prayers, their oaths, their public piety. But public and private belief have always diverged in esoteric traditions. The Cathars held masses with bread and wine, while privately denying the need for sacraments. The Sufi mystics recited Quranic verses while embracing a deeply personal inner mysticism. The Templars, steeped in both East and West, may have done the same, presenting one Christ to Rome and another to themselves. A critical moment comes in a 1309 interrogation of a Templar named Pierre of Bologna. Asked about the crucifixion, he answered carefully, "The Lord suffered, in the body perhaps, but not in the spirit. The spirit does not die." That phrasing is curious. Almost word for word, it matches a passage in the second treatise of the great Seth, a Gnostic gospel, in which Jesus declares that another died in his place, while he stood laughing, untouched by suffering, watching from above. Of course, to the Church, this was poison. A Christ who doesn't die, doesn't bleed, doesn't submit, that's not a savior. That's a usurper. And yet such ideas were preserved not only in dusty Egyptian caves, but perhaps in Templar libraries, copied in code, whispered in oaths, And if they did possess a gospel that upheld this version of Jesus, a Christ who frees through knowledge rather than sacrifice, it would explain everything. The secrecy, the architecture, the heresy trials, the executions. Let's not forget the curious case of the Templar idol, often mischaracterized as a demonic head. One inquisitorial record describes it not as a demon, but as a face with eyes closed, and a mouth that spoke not yet shown. Again, this isn't the stuff of Satanism, it's imagery that fits the Gnostic model Christ, as inner illumination, not public proclamation. The idol may have been a symbolic vessel, a reminder of the hidden Christ who operates beyond liturgy. This brings us to the idea of two gospels, not just physically, but spiritually. One gospel is loud, canonized, approved. It tells of miracles, crucifixion, resurrection. The other is quiet, fragmented. It tells of stillness, of waking, of finding the divine not in obedience but in remembrance. The Templars, if this theory holds, held both in their hands. One to present, one to protect, and the cost of that protection, everything. Because dual belief is harder to kill than heresy. Heresy can be burned. Duality hides. It smiles while kneeling at Mass. It recites prayers with lips, but not with heart. It survives inquisitions, survives Rome, survives even disbandment. And perhaps that's the real danger the Church feared, not that the Templars denied Christ, but that they quietly replaced him. Or rather, restored him. To a version that came not to save, but to remind. There's something unsettling about silence where there should be screams. In the earliest Gospels canonized by the Church, Jesus suffers. He is arrested, tried, mocked, flogged, and nailed to a cross. His death is the turning point, the sacrifice that redeems humanity's fall. But in a collection of texts unearthed near Nag Hammadi in 1945, Jesus doesn't die like that. Or sometimes he doesn't die at all. These Gospels are quiet, dreamlike, detached. They speak of spirit, not flesh, revelation, not redemption. They leave out the agony, the blood, the drama. There is no crucifixion, at least not the way we've been told. And here's the strange part. In some Templar trial testimonies, you begin to hear echoes of this alternate story. Vague references, fragments. One knight claimed the Christ he revered had no wound. Another spoke of a truth made flesh, but not broken. These phrases don't come from any known canonical source, but they resonate eerily with Gnostic writings, specifically those unearthed from the sands of Egypt, almost 7 centuries after the Templars vanished. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus never performs a miracle. He never suffers. He simply teaches short, cryptic sayings meant to awaken those who have ears to hear. In the Gospel of Truth attributed to Valentinus, the crucifixion is described as a tragic mistake, a symptom of ignorance, not a divine plan. And in the Apocryphon of John, Christ reveals that the material world is a trap constructed by lesser powers, and salvation comes not through suffering, but by recognizing the divine spark within. To modern ears, it might sound poetic, maybe even harmless. But to the medieval Church, it was nuclear. A gospel that denied the crucifixion undermined every sacrament built upon it, the Mass, the confession, the very structure of redemption. Which brings us back to the Templars, because if they believed even quietly in a version of Christ that sidestepped the cross, it would explain why the Church went from championing them to burning them. Let's revisit that curious Templar phrase, the truth made flesh, but not broken. It's subtle but devastating. It suggests that Jesus came to reveal something, not to die. That his role wasn't to be sacrificed, but to illuminate. And what's more, it suggests that this truth still lives untouched by violence, undiminished by time. And this belief wasn't born in a vacuum. During their time in the Levant, the Templars had extensive contact with Eastern Christian sects, Syriac, Armenian, Nestorian, many of which preserved alternative Christologies. Some believed Jesus only appeared to suffer. Others claimed another died in his place. These weren't wild conspiracy theories. They were established theological positions debated for centuries in the early church and later condemned as heresy. So when the Templars returned to Europe with books, relics, and stories collected during their travels, it's entirely plausible that some of those texts, whether copies, translations, or commentaries, contained these unorthodox views. And if those writings found their way into initiation, rituals, chapel carvings, or secret teachings, they would be interpreted not as academic curiosities, but as a threat to the very foundation of the Church. There's also the matter of the Book of the Dove referenced in a Templar interrogation held in Paris. The text itself has never been recovered if it ever existed at all, but a scribe recorded that it described the descent of the Word into flesh without death or pain. Again, the pattern. Again, the absence of crucifixion. The image of the dove is worth lingering on. In early Christian Gnosticism, the dove represents the descent of divine knowledge. It is not a sacrificial symbol, it is a whisper of clarity, a flutter of presence. In Templar iconography, doves are rare but meaningful. A few chapels display them perched above altars carved into stone beams or subtly worked into stained glass. Not bleeding, not pierced, just present. Skeptics will say this is all projection, that we're seeing Gnosticism where there was only Gothic ornament. But they forget the Templar motto, non nobis domine non nobis, sed nomini tuo de gloriam. Not unto us, O Lord, not unto us, but to your name give the glory. A beautiful sentiment unless the name in question isn't the one shouted from pulpits, but the silent one, the hidden one whispered from soul to soul beneath the rose. Some have tried to argue that the Templars were simply misunderstood, that they were practical men, not theologians. But if that were true, how do we explain the symbols? The sealed chambers, the liturgical anomalies and coded references to a suffering-less Christ. How do we explain the stubborn refusal of so many knights to explain their rights even under torture? Silence in this case doesn't feel like guilt. It feels like guardianship. A gospel without crucifixion is like a song missing its final note. To some it sounds unfinished. To others it reveals a different melody altogether. And perhaps that's what the Templars believed, that the Church had added suffering where none was needed. That the real story was one of awakening, not atonement. No nails, no blood, just light. There it was, hanging on a crumbling wall in a chapel barely visited, barely noticed. A fresco not grand, not gilded, but stubborn. Faded by centuries, scratched by time, yet still there. It shows a man not nailed, not crowned, but standing. Calm. Surrounded by shapes that aren't angels. They're stars, or maybe eyes, or maybe something that defies tidy explanation. There's no cross, no tomb, just light around him emanating, not falling. And at his feet, a scroll unfurled. No Latin inscription, no saint's name, only a spiral. This isn't an anomaly. This is a pattern. From the Pyrenees to the Douro Valley and stone chapels and ruined cloisters once controlled by the Templars, strange images linger, fragments of a gospel never formally acknowledged, but seemingly painted, carved, and woven into the very DNA of the order's visual language. One fresco in particular, located in the chapel at Cressac-Saint-Genis in western France, depicts the scene of Christ's ascension. At first glance, it appears conventional, until you notice that his wounds are missing. There is no cross in the background, no apostles mourning at his feet. Instead, he stands within a vesica piscis, a pointed oval associated with divine geometry, and around him symbols of the zodiac. A cosmic Christ. A teacher of cycles and mystery, not a man killed on a hill. The Church may have missed the message, or more likely ignored it. Visual ambiguity allowed plausible deniability. After all, frescoes fade. Artists take liberties. But when these images appear consistently across Templar sites, sometimes in hidden corners behind altars or even in ceiling vaults, one starts to wonder, were these fragments of the lost gospel deliberately embedded in stone, waiting to be seen by those who knew what to look for? In a tiny chapel in southern Portugal, once under the jurisdiction of the Order of Christ, there's a stained glass window that has long puzzled historians. It depicts the baptism of Jesus, but John the Baptist is absent. Instead, a dove descends from above, and the waters swirl with symbols that match diagrams found in early alchemical texts. The inscription beneath reads, "The light seeks the vessel awakened." No gospel verse, no doctrinal anchor. Just a phrase that could have been lifted straight from the Gospel of Philip, another Gnostic text, rediscovered only in the 20th century. But if the Templars knew it centuries earlier, how the answer may lie in how they taught, not through lecture, but through image. Templar architecture, unlike the heavy didacticism of church cathedrals, leans toward subtlety, geometry, pattern, silence. A scroll painted beneath an altar. A lamb with 7 eyes carved into a lintel. A sun disk behind a seemingly ordinary saint's head. Clues layered beneath the surface. Not loud, not obvious, but intentional. This visual gospel, if that's what it was, would have served a dual purpose. For the uninitiated, it was decoration. For the brothers, it was scripture. Not in words, but in metaphor. A code passed not by mouth, but by gaze. One of the more controversial examples of this comes from the ruined commandery of Vasseur, once a Templar stronghold in southern France. Among the broken stones, archaeologists uncovered fragments of a fresco showing a tree, its roots above branches below. In Gnostic symbolism, the inverted tree represents the world turned inside-out, spirit over matter, awakening over obedience. Early Christian mystics, including Basilides and Valentinus, used similar imagery to describe the soul's journey away from illusion. The tree at Vaur bears no fruit, only stars. Modern historians often bristle at these interpretations. They argue that symbols can be read 100 ways, that a spiral is just a spiral, that a woundless Christ is merely artistic license. Fair. But the volume of these anomalies, consistent, thematic, unorthodox, makes coincidence a difficult argument to sustain, especially when you remember the fate of so many of these chapels. Burned, whitewashed, rebuilt, as if something had to be erased. And then there's the question of the artists. Many were likely lay brothers trained not in monastery scriptoria, but on the road exposed to Eastern influences, Arabic motifs, Jewish mysticism, Byzantine iconography. Ideas flowed with them across crusade routes through secret libraries and into pigment and plaster. Perhaps they weren't just artisans. Perhaps they were scribes of a different kind, illustrators of a gospel that couldn't be spoken. Templar rule forbade the discussion of order secrets with outsiders, but it said nothing about painting, nothing about carving, nothing about embedding gospel truths into the very fabric of the places they prayed. And so it makes a strange kind of sense. The lost gospel wasn't always hidden in vaults or buried in jars. Sometimes it was placed in the open, on ceilings, behind columns, in a chapel corner bathed in golden dusk light. Waiting, watching, surviving. And maybe that's why the church never found it, because it wasn't kept, it was lived. It was supposed to be a legal proceeding, cold, methodical, a box-checking exercise conducted under the shadow of the Pope and the pressure of a king. But the trials of the Templars were anything but tidy. Over 600 knights were interrogated across Europe. Thousands of pages were written. And then, hundreds vanished. Not misfiled, not misplaced, erased, locked away in archives never meant to be read again. What survives offers tantalizing glimpses of something the Church clearly didn't want: preserved, repeated references to a text, a reading, a ritual centered not on relics, but on a mysterious book of light. Let's start in Poitiers, 1308. A scribe notes that a group of Templars confessed to gathering at night to hear from the sacred illumination. When asked what that meant, the accused went silent. The inquisitor pressed again. The reply: "It is the Word that was before the Word." That's not from Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, but it is nearly identical to language found in the Gospel of the Egyptians, a Gnostic text rediscovered centuries later, where Christ is referred to as the Word hidden in silence. Another testimony, this time from a knight named Humbert Blanc, describes a reading during an initiation that burned the air and silenced the tongue. What kind of text silences the tongue? Perhaps one that rewrites everything. Blanc refused to repeat the words he heard even under torture. "They are not for the damned," he said. The inquisitors scribbled something, then quickly moved on. This pattern of avoidance is telling. Most accused heretics defended themselves, or when broken, confessed in detail. But the Templars walked a finer line. They neither denied nor explained. They simply withstood, which is precisely what one would expect from men trained to guard something sacred, not just from the world, but from words themselves. Then there's the Milan transcript, a lesser-known set of trial notes stored in a monastic library until the 19th century. Within it, a single page stands out, a confession that mentions the book without name, kept in the silence of the walls. The phrase is poetic, yes, but haunting. The silence of the walls. Was it metaphor, a library, a chapel, or something older, like a chamber built specifically to house what could never be spoken aloud? We have no physical copy of this book of light. No title page, no vellum scrap, no ink trail. But the testimonies paint a shape around it, vague, blurry, yet consistent. A text recited aloud by the most senior Templars. Never written in the records, never surrendered, possibly destroyed or scattered. Why was it so threatening? Because it didn't just offer a new doctrine. It apparently stripped away the need for church mediation entirely. If true, it would make the gospel the church canonized, complete with priests' penance and papal authority, entirely obsolete. And that cannot be allowed, especially when the keepers of this alternative were wealthy, powerful, and mobile. Which brings us to the gaps. So many gaps. Hundreds of testimonies referenced in church records are now missing. Some are only known because later inquisitors mentioned them in follow-ups, brief asides, like as stated in the suppressed record from Tours or the lost confession of Brother Lauren. If these records had been mundane, they would have survived. Bureaucracies, after all, are excellent at hoarding the irrelevant. But if they were dangerous, incendiary, even they would have been culled. And culled they were. It's worth mentioning that the Vatican's secret archives, recently rebranded with a slightly less ominous name, still restrict access to many Templar trial documents. Even with modern digitization, certain files remain physically off-limits. Only approved scholars under supervision, with no photography allowed. Why what's left to hide about a medieval order disbanded 7 centuries ago? There's a curious case of a Dominican friar named Aymon de Saint-Just, who in 1311 wrote a private letter to his superior expressing concern over the words read by the knights, which spoke of truth without death, of the word without pain. The friar admitted he could not refute what he heard, only fear it. The letter was intercepted. Aymon vanished shortly after. His name never appears again in Dominican rolls. His writings apart from that letter do not survive. Is this gospel a fabrication, a metaphor, a projection from modern minds onto fragile medieval pages? Possibly. But the uniform language, the guarded expressions, and the Church's own behavior suggest otherwise. Something was read, something the knights would not recant, something the Church would not repeat. And when an institution that preserves everything decides to forget something on purpose, that's where you start digging. So we are left with partial truths, a scroll that's mentioned, never described, a reading that leaves men shaken and silent, a phrase, the word before the word, echoing like a bell struck in a sealed chamber. This isn't absence, it's erasure. And behind that erasure perhaps lies the gospel that was never meant to be written at all. It was catalogued, logged, registered in ink by a papal scribe whose name no one remembers. In 1312, amidst the smoldering collapse of the Templar order, a document was recorded in the archives of Avignon under the deceptively plain title Scriptura Suspecta, a suspect writing. Just one of many seized texts, or so it seemed. But this one was different. It was not burned, not condemned publicly, not even translated. It was taken, locked away, and after that brief entry in the ledger, nothing. No further mention, no annotations, no trail. The manuscript simply vanished. Except, of course, manuscripts don't vanish, not without help. The setting was already charged. Pope Clement V had moved the papacy to Avignon just a few years earlier, turning the city into a new Rome, but one closer to French power and more malleable to French demands. The Templar arrests were still unfolding, and evidence, real or invented, was pouring in from across Europe. Most of it was routine land deeds, trial transcripts, property inventories. But this document was logged separately. In the margin, the scribe added 3 Latin words in smaller hand non-legenda publis, not to be read publicly. That one note has haunted archivists for centuries. What was this manuscript? No description of content. No author, no language specified. Just a title or perhaps a placeholder suspect writing. But in the chaotic days following the Templar suppression, multiple rumors swirled. Some claimed a gospel had been discovered among confiscated items in a commandery outside Montpellier. Others whispered that a text had been delivered voluntarily by a frightened Templar seeking absolution in exchange for a heretical book. But the version that endures, the one passed down in letters and later memoirs, is that a document was intercepted in transit. Bound for Portugal. Headed west. It was taken near Toulouse, handed off to papal agents, and brought to Avignon under guard. And then it disappeared. This alone might have faded into obscurity were it not for an unsigned letter found decades later folded into the pages of a bishop's diary. The letter dated 1337 refers obliquely to the writing of the unsuffering, a curious title if ever there was one. The author claims to have seen it just once, describing it as a vision of the Word, not bound to flesh, nor ending in death. Again, we hear the refrain, a Christ who does not suffer a gospel without blood. The same theological shape found in Gnostic texts and whispered in the Templar trials. The letter also claims that the manuscript was written on treated skin, dark as wine, with lettering that shimmered like metal in firelight. This is not standard parchment. This is a deliberate artifact, a message built to last and perhaps to resist copying. The scribe mentions that the text began in silence, no opening blessing, no invocation. Just a line, "The light entered," without name. That line does not appear in any canonical gospel, but it does echo concepts from the trimorphic Protonoia, a Gnostic text, in which the divine voice descends in stages concealed in forms never entirely revealed. And once again, the emphasis is on awakening, not atonement. If the letter is authentic, and scholars still argue this, it suggests the manuscript seized at Avignon was not only dangerous, but unique. A one-of-a-kind document, possibly ancient, possibly created during the Templars' time in the Holy Land, or copied from something even older. But here's where it gets stranger. In the 17th century, a Jesuit archivist named Louis Poincaré compiled an inventory of lost papal documents. One entry is particularly intriguing. It references a 14th century manuscript described only as Gospelum Templariorum, the Gospel of the Templars. No content summary, no location, just a note that it was once kept in the red case beneath the floor of the chapel of St. Martial. That chapel no longer exists. It was razed in the 1700s. The red case was never recovered, and no one has seen the gospel since. Coincidence or continuity? Consider the evidence. A manuscript captured and hidden, a phrase echoed in trial testimonies, a gospel of light without crucifixion, a document that supposedly ends not with a resurrection, but with a question. And what do you remember? That line too appears in one of the Nag Hammadi texts, the Dialogue of the Savior, which was unknown to scholars until 1945, unless of course someone had seen it before. The Avignon manuscript may have been that missing link. Not a complete gospel, perhaps, but a synthesis, a recollection, a guide for initiates passed between hands, hidden in cloisters, finally entrusted to those who could keep it safe. The Church's silence on the matter is deafening. Official records make no reference to the loss. Papal correspondence from the period is curiously blank between April and June of 1312, the same period the manuscript was seized. And even today, when researchers request access to Templar-era inventories, they're often met with politeness and locked doors. What happened to the manuscript? Was it burned by frightened clerics who read too far and too freely? Was it hidden in the Vatican's deepest vaults, a secret buried by those sworn to uphold the truth, not reveal it? Or was it taken again, smuggled out, passed down, and perhaps still waiting? Whatever the answer, one thing is certain. The gospel seized at Avignon left no physical trace, only silence. And sometimes silence is the loudest clue of all. He didn't scream. He didn't beg. Jacques de Molay, last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, stood on the small island in the Seine in 1314, bound to a stake as fire licked the air around him. Eyewitnesses say he looked straight ahead, calm, unmoved, even as the flames took his feet. And then just before the smoke reached his face, he spoke. Not a curse, though many claim it was. Not a confession. A statement. A riddle let Pope Clement and King Philip answer to God within the year. And they did. Both men were dead within months. History remembers the moment as one of defiance, a final act of vengeance from a betrayed man. But others have wondered, what if it was something else? A warning, a prophecy, or the final coded message of a secret keeper, ensuring that his last words would echo louder than any scream. What often goes unmentioned is that this wasn't the first time de Molay had spoken cryptically. During his imprisonment, he refused to explain the deeper rites of the order. He acknowledged the public teachings, the nightly vows, the external theology. But when questioned about certain readings, private ones whispered during high initiations, he simply said, "That knowledge is not mine to reveal." There is one account buried in the Rouen trial records, where de Molay is reported to have described a text kept between breaths. When asked what that meant, he remained silent. A scribe added a marginal note, possibly mad. But others weren't so sure. You see, between breaths is a phrase found in Gnostic and Sufi teachings alike. It refers to the liminal space, the divine moment when revelation occurs, not in speech, but in silence. In the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, there's a line, "The teacher spoke to me not in words, but in the space between." Again, the same rhythm, the same shape of thought. And de Molay, who spent years in the Holy Land, would have encountered these traditions, these metaphors. What if his silence wasn't obstinacy, but ritual? In his final days, de Molay requested no priest, no confession. He was offered absolution by papal representatives. He declined. He didn't reject God, but he did refuse the Church's version of him. That in itself was a sermon. And what's more, he left behind a symbol. After the execution, a small group of loyal brothers retrieved what they could from the order's scattered possessions. Among them was a carved wooden panel said to have hung in de Molay's private chapel. It showed a tree, not a cross, with roots descending into stars and branches spiraling upward into flame. No Christ, no nails, just motion, silence, and light. The tree was ringed with writing in a cipher that was only cracked in the late 20th century. And its message, a single line: "The light is not extinguished, only hidden." That line became a motto of sorts, passed through esoteric circles, reproduced in Rosicrucian tracts, echoed in Masonic rituals. Many believe this is coincidence. But coincidence wears a familiar robe when you're dealing with secrets long buried. De Molay's riddle lives on, not just in the deaths of his enemies, but in the persistent idea that he died not as a heretic, but as a guardian. The Church burned a man. They expected the flame to consume his secrets. But what if the fire was part of the plan, a final sleight of hand? The Church watched the Grand Master burn, but they never found the gospel. There's a persistent legend that before his arrest, de Molay arranged for certain documents to be dispersed. Some say they went to Portugal. Others claim Scotland. Still others suggest they were hidden in plain sight, disguised as property ledgers, land transfers, or liturgical texts. The truth we don't know. But what we do know is this: de Molay held something back. Not gold, not relics. Something quieter. Something invisible. And in his silence, he preserved it. Modern scholars argue about the existence of this lost gospel. They demand proof, a page, a signature. But maybe the proof isn't material. Maybe it's linguistic, a recurring phrase, a series of symbols, a pattern too consistent to dismiss. Take, for instance, the phrase, "the word does not suffer." It appears in 3 separate Templar testimonies. It appears in Gnostic scripture. It appears again in the cipher from de Molay's panel. That's not coincidence. That's intention. And maybe that's the point. The gospel isn't missing. It's whispering, through paintings, through phrases, through a Grand Master's refusal to speak when the world demanded it. His silence wasn't cowardice. It was containment. Jacques de Molay didn't burn for treasure. He burned for something invisible, a truth so fragile it could only be carried in metaphor code and deathbed riddles. The Church destroyed the man, but they never found the key, because the last secret wasn't in his hand. It was in the space between his words. When the fires of France finally died out, and the last embers of the Templar order were swept into ash, it would have seemed reasonable to think the story was over. The knights were scattered, their lands confiscated, their leaders executed, and yet somehow the order didn't die. Not really. In Portugal, it simply changed its name, shifted its symbols, and kept breathing. The church allowed it. The crown supported it. And the men who once wore the Red Cross began again, this time under a different banner, the Order of Christ. It was a clever move, brilliant really. In 1319, just 5 years after Jacques de Molay's death, King Dinis of Portugal petitioned Pope John XXIII to create a new military order, one that would take over Templar lands, continue their charitable missions, and of course serve the Church. The Pope, reluctant to lose control but eager to stabilize the region, agreed. On the surface, it was a political maneuver, but underneath, continuity. The Grand Master of the new order was a former Templar. Many of the knights were the same, and the rule they followed nearly identical to that of the old order. Why does this matter? Because if the Templars had been safeguarding a gospel, hiding it, copying it, passing it through secret channels, it didn't vanish in the flames of Paris. It simply moved south, quietly. Tamar became the new heart of the order, a small city with an oversized role in Portuguese history. It housed the Convento de Cristo, a sprawling complex that blended Romanesque solemnity with late Gothic exuberance. But within that stone labyrinth lies something stranger, a central round church, modeled after the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. A familiar design, a familiar reverence. But what's carved inside speaks louder than architecture alone. In the corolla, the centerpiece of the church, images swirl in gold and shadow. Christ appears, yes, but not crucified, not bleeding. Instead, he stands among stars, surrounded by angelic beings bearing scrolls, orbs, and veiled symbols. No wounds, no suffering. And beneath his feet, a serpent not crushed, but coiled calm, watching. That image alone would have sparked outrage in 14th century Rome. But in Tomar, it was celebrated, funded, protected, even elevated. Many of the frescoes inside the convent carry curious inscriptions, Latin phrases with unusual grammar names that don't appear in the Vulgate Bible. One scroll bears the phrase Lux est verbum non crucis. Light is the word, not the cross. That line isn't canonical, it's not doctrinal, but it echoes again the themes we've traced from Rennes-le-Château to Jerusalem. Light, not blood. Word, not death. Even the outer decorations whisper clues. Carvings of 7-pointed stars, doves cradled in vines, twin pillars wrapped in thorns that never pierce. To a casual visitor, these are embellishments, but to the initiated, symbols, keys. Memory turned to stone, and there's more. In 1420, under the leadership of Prince Henry, the navigator himself, a Grand Master of the Order of Christ, the Portuguese began their age of discoveries. Ships were blessed at Tamar. Maps were drawn under its vaulted ceilings, and aboard many of those ships, priests, scribes, and sometimes cryptic cargo. One persistent rumor tells of a small leather-bound book kept in the personal chapel of Prince Henry. It was not listed in any inventory, but visitors described a text of Eastern origin that contained verses of the Logos written in a language like Greek, but not. It was never shown to outsiders, never named. But some whispered it was the traveler's gospel, a gift from the old order to the new one, carried across oceans like a seed awaiting new soil. Was this the lost gospel, or a copy, or a fragment translated into an obscure dialect and hidden in plain sight? We may never know. But what's undeniable is that the Order of Christ preserved something, a tone, a rhythm, a whisper of knowledge that didn't fit within the clean lines of Catholic dogma. Even today, visitors to Tomar sense the difference. It doesn't feel like a monastery. It feels like a message, the kind written not in ink but in echo. And perhaps that was always the plan. Portugal, distant from Rome, protected by geography and politics, became a sanctuary, not just for knights, but for knowledge. A safe harbor for ideas too radiant, too radical to survive elsewhere. The Templars may have been burned in France, but in Portugal they bloomed. And if they carried a gospel, something hidden beneath Jerusalem, or gifted by the Cathars, or transcribed from whispers in the desert, then Tomar may be its final earthly vault. The last place it was read aloud. The last place it was believed. Because faith, after all, doesn't always need to shout. Sometimes it just needs to survive. In 2011, a quiet storm broke across the world of biblical archaeology. A collection of tiny lead books bound like miniature codices inscribed in mysterious characters was reportedly found in a cave near northern Jordan, not far from the ancient trade routes that once connected Jerusalem to Damascus. Their discovery, if real, could have rewritten everything. But instead of celebration, they were met with skepticism. Questions of authenticity, accusations of forgery, debates over provenance, and then silence. But one detail refused to be silenced. On one of the codices, rusted, warped, but still legible, was an inscription roughly translated as, "He who sees with light does not die." That phrase, as haunting as it is beautiful, sparked a flurry of recognition among a handful of fringe scholars. Because it wasn't just poetic, it was familiar. Almost identical wording had been whispered centuries earlier in a very different context by Templars. Back during the French trials, one obscure testimony from a knight in Lyon referenced a book of light, whose final line he claimed was, "Those who see with the light will not taste death." It was dismissed as mystical gibberish. But now, in a lead codex pulled from the rocks of the Jordanian desert, nearly the same phrase resurfaced. Coincidence or continuity? Let's talk about what these codices were. Each one is about the size of a credit card. Thin sheets of lead folded into book form, sealed at the edges with binding rings. Some are blank. Others contain pages covered in what looks like Paleo-Hebrew Nabatean script, and even a few Greek characters, although in an order that defies standard syntax. Among the symbols, stars, branches, menorahs, fish, and a peculiar recurring image of a seven-pointed halo radiating from a central face. Not crowned, not crucified, just luminous. The symbolism bears a striking resemblance to Templar-era carvings found in Portugal, southern France, and even parts of Cyprus regions, where the order had strongholds. The face in the halo mirrors almost exactly a relief carved above the entrance to the chapel of Saint João Baptista in Tomar, and the inscription virtually identical to a phrase embedded in the cipher discovered in de Molay's chapel panel. At first glance, these connections seem implausible. How could 12th century European knights have anything to do with lead books buried in Jordan? But remember, the Templars spent nearly 2 centuries in the Holy Land. They occupied Jerusalem. They traded with Syrians, Persians, and Arab Christians. They weren't just warriors. They were builders, diplomats, and crucially collectors of texts. Several historical records mention Templar contact with Eastern Christian sects, especially the Melkites and Nestorians, who were known for preserving apocryphal writings rejected by Rome. One Byzantine chronicle notes that Templar messengers visited a monastery near Mount Sinai in 1236, where they received gifts of parchment and teachings not written in Latin tongue. The chronicle doesn't specify what these teachings were, But Mount Sinai isn't far from where the lead codices would later surface. And here's where it gets even stranger. In 1325, a letter written by a former Templar knight in exile in Aragon refers to a codex of metal given to the order by a brother of the desert. The letter, discovered centuries later in a private collection, was ignored by mainstream historians. Who would write gospels on metal, who would seal them in lead, and yet that's exactly what the codices are. The contents of the lead books remain disputed. Some claim they're forgeries created for money. Others say they are ancient Christian texts written by early Jewish followers of Jesus, but their hybrid symbolism, their esoteric phrases, and their quiet emphasis on inner vision over institutional salvation all echo the same themes we've traced through Templar belief. One passage, roughly translated, reads, "The veil is within. Tear it not with sword, but with light." A beautiful line, and one that sounds remarkably like something a Templar initiate might have heard in the darkness of an initiation chamber. Critics point to the lack of scholarly consensus. The codices are fragmentary, their language obscure, their authenticity unproven. But perhaps that is precisely the point. A gospel like this would never be handed over in clear Latin, signed and sealed with papal approval. It would hide, fold into obscurity, be passed between exiles, sealed in lead, buried not just in earth, but in time. And the fact that this obscure artifact, discovered by accident, surrounded by controversy, largely ignored, contains phrasing that mirrors suppressed Templar testimony that should give us pause. There's also the quiet problem of pattern recognition. When phrases, symbols, and themes recur across continents and centuries in communities that were never supposed to be in contact, something is being transmitted. Maybe not directly, maybe not cleanly, but undeniably. The Templars may not have written the lead codices, but they may have read them, copied them, carried fragments of them into Europe, translated their meaning into fresco initiation and silence. And perhaps this is the greatest clue of all, that when finally unearthed a gospel the world wasn't ready for, looked less like a book and more like a whisper in metal. He wore camel's hair, ate locusts, baptized in rivers. And then he disappeared, beheaded, yes, but only after delivering a message that some believe was more than just a prelude to Jesus. To most Christians, John the Baptist is a warm-up act, a herald, the one who clears the stage so the real Messiah can enter. But to the Johannites, an obscure spiritual sect whispered about in the shadows of medieval Europe, John wasn't the messenger. He was the truth. And according to certain fringe theories, the Templars didn't just know about this heresy. They adopted it, protected it, built their rituals around it. The Johannite heresy, as it came to be known, proposes a stunning reversal that John the Baptist, not Jesus of Nazareth, was the true spiritual teacher. That Jesus was a rival, a usurper, or at least a misunderstood interpreter of John's deeper path. The theory isn't Catholic approved, to put it gently. It was denounced as early as the 3rd century and mostly vanished from public discourse. But fragments survived, hidden in rare texts encoded in symbols and allegedly preserved by the Templars. Evidence, nothing definitive. But the trail is strange. In 1818, a French priest named Jean-Baptiste Ganneau, part mystic, part rogue theologian, claimed that the Knights Templar had secretly followed the Johannite tradition passed down from John through a hidden spiritual lineage. Ganneau was largely dismissed in his time, but he wasn't inventing the idea from whole cloth. His sources included obscure French manuscripts, regional folklore, and most intriguingly, carvings in Templar churches that emphasize John far more than Jesus. In the Church of Leon, for instance, A carved lintel above the main entrance depicts John baptizing not Jesus, but a faceless figure surrounded by fire. A strange detail. And inside the altar's central stone, traditionally reserved for Christ, is marked with a lamb holding a reed staff, a symbol sometimes associated with John. One could argue artistic liberty, or perhaps artistic caution. More convincing is the Templar coinage. Some surviving deniers the currency minted by the order show a bearded face in profile surrounded by stars. It's long been assumed to be Christ, but no cruciform halo, no marks of suffering, just a calm face with wild hair. Some numismatists now speculate it may be John, not Jesus, especially when viewed alongside the coin's reverse, which bears the cryptic phrase, "in the light of the first voice." And then there's the troubling testimony of a Templar named Raymond de Garnier, who during his trial said, "We honor the voice before the flame." He refused to clarify under questioning. But in Gnostic and Johannite literature, John is repeatedly referred to as the voice, the one crying in the wilderness, the one who speaks before light incarnates. The flame in this metaphor may represent the Christ of the Church, bright consuming, but not the origin. Why would the Templars follow this path? Because it offered something profoundly different. In Johannite theology, salvation doesn't come from sacrifice. It comes from self-mastery, from purification, from knowledge passed from teacher to student like a living scroll. John was not a martyr, he was a revealer, and the true baptism wasn't one of water, but of fire within the fire of inner knowing. This fits eerily well with Templar rituals. The symbolic denial of Christ, the whispered teachings, the silence around certain names, even the insistence that certain truths could not be written down, only spoken. If the order had embraced Johannite teachings, it would explain the absence of traditional crucifixion imagery in many of their chapels and the elevation of John in artwork, architecture, and myth. One manuscript found in the library of the Abbey of Echternach, once a Templar-frequented site, references a gospel of the voice that predates the writings of the cross. The language is murky, and the passage was long ignored by scholars. But a closer reading suggests the author believed there was a text, a gospel focused solely on John's teachings, independent of the four canonical accounts. Was this gospel ever in Templar hands? The record doesn't say. But the tone implies reverence, protection, secrecy. Another peculiar artifact is the so-called Baptist cross, a wooden emblem uncovered in a collapsed Templar outpost in northern Spain. It bears no crucified figure. Instead, a reed bends across its arms, flanked by two suns, one rising, one setting. Some see it as a symbol of duality. Others interpret it as John's dominance light both before and after. Critics argue that the Johannite connection is overblown, that Gounod and his followers projected their mysticism onto the Templars for romantic effect. But Romanticism doesn't explain the carvings, the symbols, the selective silences. And it certainly doesn't explain why, of all saints, John the Baptist appears so frequently in the iconography of an order supposedly dedicated to Christ the King. And perhaps that's the answer. The Templars may not have denied Christ, but they may have believed he was the second voice, not the first, the student, not the teacher. And in doing so, they embraced a gospel that never made it into canon. One of purification, silence, and a baptism that happens in the soul, not the Jordan. If that gospel ever existed in physical form, ink on skin, wrapped in cloth, sealed by the order, it has yet to surface. But its shape lingers. In stone. In code. In the cryptic gaze of John, carved above an altar where Jesus should be. The lagoon guards its secrets well. Venice, a city of masks and shadows, of twisting alleys and labyrinthine canals, has always known how to hide things in plain sight. And during the 13th and 14th centuries, when the Templars were being hunted in France, and their silence was being purchased with fire, Venice became a haven. A place where knowledge could be smuggled not in chests, but in pages, symbols, and light. It wasn't official, of course. The city had no love for the Church's overreach, but neither did it openly defy Rome. It simply looked the other way. And within that strategic blindness, certain manuscripts found refuge, especially the ones that couldn't be named. Among the archives of the Scuola Grande di San Giovanni Evangelista, a peculiar inventory dated 1321 lists a series of mirror books texts written in reverse meant to be read with polished glass. Most were devotional or medical, a curious but not unheard of medieval trick. But one item stands apart, a volume titled Verbum Lucis, or the Word of Light, listed without author origin or liturgical category. It vanished from the collection shortly after. The name alone is suspicious. Word of Light is a phrase echoed in multiple Templar trial testimonies. In one, a knight confessed to hearing it during his initiation. They read from the Word of Light, which shines in the unseen. The inquisitor assumed it was allegory. But what if it was literal? Let's linger for a moment on the mirror texts. Writing in reverse, especially in Latin or early Italian, was more than novelty. It was security. It made a book harder to copy, harder to interpret, without the correct tool, and nearly impossible to stumble across unintentionally. Reverse script has been found in Coptic Gnostic codices as well, particularly those containing teachings not intended for public worship, but for private spiritual initiation. One Venetian manuscript, now lost but referenced in a 17th century scholarly treatise, reportedly began with a sentence that required two mirrors, one vertical, one horizontal, to read. A literal cross of reflection. The sentence, "Truth stands not in blood, but in stillness." The phrasing aligns uncannily with the Gospel of Thomas, and again with Templar testimony that repeatedly describes a Christ who does not suffer, but shows. Venetian glassmakers of the era were the finest in Europe, and their techniques, especially on Murano, were closely guarded. It's no stretch to imagine that these artisans were also commissioned to create mirrors not just for beauty, but for function. Reading mirrors, ritual mirrors, and perhaps encrypted ones. One artifact from the period now held in private collection is a silver-backed mirror with runic characters etched along its rim. The symbols are Nordic at first glance, but interspersed with Greek and Latin letters that don't form any legible phrase unless you rotate the mirror. Then, reflected correctly, the script reveals a line in Latin: non per crucem sed per lumen. Not through the cross, but through the light. This is not casual heresy. This is pointed theological defiance, and it echoes Templar rhetoric to a degree that can't be brushed off. Further complicating things is the presence of a small group of scribes known as the Scriptorum Lucis, mentioned in only two Venetian guild records from the 1330s. Their role officially copying devotional texts for private patrons. But their emblem, two intersecting circles around a central flame, matches a carving found in the Templar round church of Verona. And their pricing ledger refers to mirror editions, 7-layer codices, and something ominously labeled custodium absconditum, the hidden custody. These phrases isolated could be dismissed, but viewed collectively, they point toward a coordinated effort to preserve something unorthodox, encrypted, and deeply theological. So why Venice? Because Venice was connected to the East, to trade, to knowledge that moved without passports. The Templars, during their time in the Holy Land, would have encountered the concept of the Kitab al-Majjar, books of reflection used by certain Islamic mystics who believed sacred texts should not be read directly, but encountered through symbolic inversion. That idea of spiritual insight coming through reversal might have been carried westward past to sympathetic scribes and embedded into Templar lore. This also explains the scarcity of direct quotations. If a gospel was encoded through reflection, it would not have been read in court. It would have required tools, context training. It would have been useless to an inquisitor and invaluable to an initiate. By the 1400s, mirror texts began to disappear. The printing press made such encryption obsolete, but not before the concept migrated into architecture, into coded poetry, even into secret societies that would later be accused of preserving ancient truths denied by Rome. And perhaps through it all, the original gospel, what the Templars may have carried back from the East, survived. Not in full, not in ink, but in fragments, reflections. The shape of an idea kept alive in reversed letters and whispered rituals. Because in Venice, nothing is ever what it seems, and the light, if you learn to look backwards, is still there. It was the most dangerous reading list in history. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the index of forbidden books, wasn't just a list of naughty novels or questionable theology. It was a vault of ideas deemed so corrosive to the Catholic worldview that they had to be suppressed, silenced, in some cases, physically destroyed. From the mid-1500s until 1966, the index expanded into a sprawling blacklist: scientific treatises, revolutionary manifestos, mystical doctrines, and critically alternative gospels. Yet buried among the obvious names, Copernicus, Galileo, Luther, are quieter entries, obscure titles with curious themes, books that speak not of heresy outright, but of inner light, unmediated truth, and a Christ unbound from suffering. Echoes again of the same gospel we've been following. The index was meant to protect the faithful from error, but sometimes what it hid wasn't error, it was competition. Take, for example, the Evangelium Veritatis, or Gospel of Truth. It was never officially canonized, never even widely known, until it was unearthed at Nag Hammadi. Yet oddly, a 17th-century version of the index includes a work by the same name flagged only as of heretical origin, confusing to readers, suggestive of Valentinian notions. That reference, brief and unexplained, was struck through in later editions. Why, who read it? And why did they feel the need to erase its mention? Some scholars have suggested that copies of this gospel or others like it survived longer than we assume. Passed from hand to hand, recopied under false titles, maybe even bound inside other books. And if so, the Templars, famed for their access to Eastern texts, their literacy and their secretive traditions, would have been natural stewards. What's more telling is the language used by the index itself. Certain texts are condemned not just for content, but for tone. One entry refers to a banned manuscript as possessing a voice of inner certainty. Another condemns a book that teaches the soul does not fall, but merely forgets. These aren't treatises on devil worship, they're gospels of light. And then there's the Speculum Lucis, the mirror of light. Listed in the 1595 Venetian edition of the Index, it's described as an anonymous gospel treating the Incarnation as illusion and the resurrection as metaphor. The title alone should sound familiar. We've seen this phrase, light as word, mirror as gospel, again and again in Templar-related artifacts, trial testimony, and encrypted inscriptions. Was this the same gospel the Templars were accused of reading, if not the very same, perhaps a copy, a translation, or a distant echo? Even more curious is the presence of Templar-related documents in the index. In 1612, a collection of translated trial records originally intended for theological study was banned. Not for blasphemy, but for leading the reader to sympathize with impiety. What impiety precisely was so infectious that even historical transcripts had to be silenced? Perhaps the most damning entry of all comes from the 18th century Roman edition. It references a manuscript known only by its ciphered catalog number, D17, no title, no author, just a warning, a gospel not written by apostles, but by initiates. Dangerous as it appears, Christian, but is not. It was reportedly destroyed in 1734 by fire on Vatican orders. Now we can't prove that D17 was the Templar gospel. But its description, apostolic in tone yet secretly heterodox, is exactly what one would expect from a text preserved by a knightly order bound by secrecy, but immersed in theology. And still the pattern continues. Certain themes light over blood, awakening over sacrifice, spirit over flesh, keep appearing in the very books the Church felt compelled to ban. Again and again. The Gospel of Mary, the Dialogue of the Savior, the Pistis Sophia. And again we see similar lines in Templar inscriptions, mirrored texts, carved symbols. The Index never lists a Templar gospel by name, but its fingerprints are everywhere, in what it bans, in how it censors, and in what it refuses to even describe. The fact that some entries lack summaries, lack citations, suggests something more than danger. They suggest fear. A fear not of open blasphemy, but of the quiet gospel. The one that reads like scripture, sounds like truth, and whispers that salvation isn't given. It's remembered. So perhaps the Index didn't just suppress books. Perhaps it mapped a shadow canon, a second gospel shelf, invisible but real. And if the Templars had a place on that shelf, if their hidden text once sat beneath a seal marked, not with a cross, but a flame, then the Index didn't bury the truth. It confirmed it. Because what you forbid, you fear. And what you fear, you often cannot destroy. Along the dusty northern coastline of modern-day Lebanon lies the ruins of Arca, a name few remember, a place fewer still have visited. But in the 12th century, Arca was a vital outpost for the Knights Templar. Strategically placed between Tripoli and the mountainous interior, it served not just as a military garrison, but according to some overlooked letters from the period, as a center of learning. A quiet node in the web of the Levant, where European knights, Eastern mystics, and itinerant scribes crossed paths, and perhaps where the lost gospel took on new life. The chroniclers of the time had little to say about Arca. It was not a place of great battles or famous relics, but beneath that silence lies a subtle intrigue. Letters written by Templar commanders mention gatherings of the ink scrolls received under the moon, and most curiously, the ghost in the scriptoria. That phrase, easy to overlook, was repeated twice, once by a knight named Bertrand of Jaffa, and again by an anonymous scribe in a marginal note. The ghost walks when the lamps are out, and the word is read backwards. What could this mean? Some scholars brush it off as superstition, campfire whispers. But the idea of a ghost gospel, something read secretly hidden in plain sight, has persisted for centuries. And if there was any place, it might have been copied, protected, and preserved. Arca fits the bill. The region surrounding Arca was home to a unique blend of Christian sects: Syriac, Orthodox, Maronites, Melkites, each with their own scriptures, rites, and traditions. Many of these sects had gospels unfamiliar to Latin Christendom, not heretical per se, but unendorsed. Among them were fragments of the Gospel of the 12, the Gospel of the Hebrews, and several now lost Syriac texts focused not on Christ's passion, but on his hidden sayings and post-resurrection teachings. One surviving scroll, now in fragments, tells of a Christ who entered through breath, left through light. These were the communities the Templars encountered, not enemies, but hosts. The knights learned their languages, protected their monasteries, even shared meals in cloisters untouched by Rome. And over time, something subtle happened: transmission. Not by conquest, but by curiosity. Not in public, but in shadow. One document, a faded parchment discovered in the early 1900s near Tripoli, bears a Latin heading that reads, Ad fratres in Archa, to the brothers in Archa. The body of the text is in Syriac, peppered with strange symbols and reversed characters. No full translation has ever been made, but the opening lines have been deciphered. The word is not dead. It sleeps. It is placed in you like fire beneath ash. The style is unmistakably Gnostic, and its preservation in a Templar archive, even at the edges of the Order's world, suggests intentional safeguarding. One of the more haunting stories from the region comes from a Cistercian monk who traveled through the area decades after the Templars' fall. In his journal, he records a tale told by local Christian villagers of a black-caped knight who returned once a year to a cave outside Arca. There he would light a candle, speak aloud in a language no one understood, and disappear before sunrise. They called him the Ghost of the Red Cross. Folklore, likely. But oddly consistent with Templar legend, the idea of a surviving line of guardians preserving something too dangerous to be allowed above ground. Let's not forget that Arca was no backwater. It sat along trade routes connecting Antioch to Jerusalem, Aleppo to Tyre. It was a crossroads of language, goods, and beliefs. Greek, Arabic, Armenian, Syriac, and Latin all coexisted there, creating a natural incubator for translation and textual exchange. If a gospel was going to be recopied in secret, transcribed into Latin from an Eastern dialect, encoded with cipher hidden among innocuous prayer books, this was the place. There are architectural clues, too. The ruins of the Templar commandery in Arca, excavated only partially, reveal a rectangular chamber with no windows, a stone lectern carved into the wall, and a ventilation shaft positioned in a way that suggests it was designed for candle use over long hours. Not a chapel, not a dormitory, but a scriptorium. More than one archaeologist has commented on the odd symbol etched above the lectern, a dove descending into an open book ringed by 7 stars. Not a common Christian motif, but it does appear in Templar manuscripts elsewhere, particularly in marginalia found in the Tomar archives in Portugal and on a weathered tile in the ruined commandery of La Rochelle. The consistency of the symbol suggests more than decoration. It's a signature, perhaps even the mark of the gospel itself. And what of the text? Nothing has surfaced from Arca directly. But one possible candidate exists, a single page now held in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, catalogued as an apocryphal meditation. It came from a 14th century collection acquired near Tripoli. Its style is unlike anything else in the compilation. The Latin is archaic, rhythmic, layered with metaphor. One line reads, "He did not die. He walked backward into the flame and left no shadow." A strange phrase, but perhaps not metaphorical. Because the gospel the Templars guarded may never have been about history. It may have been a map of inner transformation, read not with eyes but with understanding. And in Arca, in the space between languages, between traditions, between East and West, it may have found one of its last safe homes. The Church feared heresy in the courts of Paris. But the real gospel, the one of silence and light, was already long gone. South, east, into the dust, and still the ghost walks. It's hard to imagine Christianity without sin. The fall, the apple, the exile. Original guilt passed down like a bloodline, every soul born under a weight it didn't choose. And then, of course, salvation, the cross, the sacrifice, the redemption. One wound to cover all wounds. This is the rhythm of orthodox belief. But the Templars, it seems, may have held a different score. In the quiet rooms of their commanderies, beneath symbols carved in stone and light, a whisper echoed, "What if there was no fall? What if sin was an invention and salvation a story?" This isn't just speculative theology. There are fragments, hints left behind like fingerprints on old parchment. One phrase in particular appears in at least 3 separate Templar trial transcripts: "He who knows does not kneel." The Church called it arrogance, but the phrasing aligns with Gnostic traditions, where knowledge gnosis is the path to spiritual liberation. Not contrition, not blood. In the Gospel of Mary, Jesus says, "There is no sin, but you make sin when you do the things that are like sin." A curious line, one that places the burden not on transgression, but on perception. In this worldview, sin isn't inherited, it's misapprehended. The soul isn't fallen, it's asleep. And the gospel isn't about a savior descending to rescue, but a teacher waking others up. Now consider how Templar theology may have reflected this. Their rituals emphasized secrecy, inner transformation, and spiritual awakening. The knight was not simply a soldier. He was a seeker, a traveler through stages of initiation. And while Rome preached forgiveness through penance, the Templars, according to scattered testimony, spoke instead of remembering the fire within. One surviving fragment of a Templar liturgy found in the Vatican's suppressed index and attributed to a German commandery reads, "The light is whole. We are not broken. Let the false wound be closed." If authentic, this alone would have been enough to label the order heretical. It denies original sin outright. It denies the need for the crucifixion. And it elevates internal recognition over ecclesiastical absolution. There are architectural reflections of this theology too. In several Templar chapels, depictions of the Last Judgment common throughout medieval Christendom are noticeably absent. In their place, scenes of baptism, illumination, or silence. In the chapel of Unate in Spain, a fresco shows a man standing alone beneath a canopy of stars' arms, open, not pleading, not judged, but aware. It's an image of reception, not repentance. And it suggests a Christ not dying for mankind, but inviting it to wake. The Church could never accept such a gospel. A faith without sin is a faith without control. If souls are not guilty, priests are not necessary. If awakening is personal, dogma dissolves. And if Christ's purpose was not to bleed, but to remind, then everything from the altar to the indulgence crumbles. One Templar under interrogation in England was recorded saying, "The cross is not the gate. The gate is within." His words were struck from the record. But they survived in the margins, copied later by a sympathetic scribe. That phrase, too, matches a line in the Gospel of Philip. "Those who say they will die first and then rise are in error. If they do not receive the resurrection while they live when they die, they will receive nothing." Again, the theme persists. The moment of transformation is not death, it is realization. Even more provocative is the order's treatment of confession. While the Templars participated in traditional rites when under scrutiny, private records from their Iberian commanderies suggest an alternate practice. In one recovered manual from the archives of Tamar, a section titled "Purification of the Flame" describes not a confession of sins, but a ritual of stillness. No priest, no penance. Only light breath and silence. The initiate was told, "Close your eyes. Recall the sound before speech." That is the truth. This practice matches nothing in the Catholic liturgy, but it aligns closely with esoteric Christian meditation preserved in Eastern monastic traditions, and curiously in the writings of early desert hermits, often branded heretics by the Roman hierarchy. If this gospel existed, whether as a full text, a series of teachings, or a coded ritual, It would not have survived by being declared. It would have survived by being lived, hidden in symbols, passed through initiation, reenacted in architecture, and safeguarded by those who believed that the Church had confused the story, that sin was a cage, and they had found the key. The final clue may lie in a phrase found carved into the stone of a Templar church in Llanelef, Brittany. It reads, "We begin where others end." Beneath it, a faint symbol, two intersecting circles forming an almond-shaped eye. The Vesica Piscis, ancient symbol of unity used by mystics to depict the opening between worlds. To the Templars, perhaps it meant more. A door not into heaven, but into awareness. The gospel they held, if it existed, did not begin with guilt. It began with light. It offered no promise of salvation because it claimed there was nothing to be saved from. Just shadows to clear. And in clearing them, not paradise, but remembrance. There's something unnerving about wax. Warmed just enough to drip, it hardens into permanence. Seals, after all, are not made for beauty. They are meant to protect, to warn, to lock away. And when one such seal is recovered centuries later bearing a symbol not catalogued in any heraldic archive, the questions multiply. Who placed it? What did it guard, and why does no record of the document it sealed exist today? In 1892, a crumbling trunk was discovered behind the altar of a former Templar chapel near La Rochelle. Most of its contents had been destroyed by time-mold sea-air careless handling. But tucked between fragments of wool and rusted chainmail was a strip of parchment. The writing had long since faded its surface, eaten by moisture. But at the corner, affixed to a loop of knotted hemp, remained a wax seal, pale red, oval, and deeply strange. It depicted a descending dove clutching a ribbon. Surrounding it, 7 stars arranged in a spiral, not a circle. Beneath it, a single word, nearly illegible. Some say it read lux Latin for light. Others argue for vox voice. But a third possibility, suggested only in passing in a French archivist's notebook, was Pax Peace. He added a single comment, possibly symbolic, or code. What's intriguing is how closely this matches previous iconography discussed in earlier chapters. The same dove and stars motif appeared carved above a lectern in Arca. It was etched into a tile found in Tomar. And now here it was sealed in wax, preserved in a forgotten box that had no business surviving this long. What could it have sealed? Traditionally, Templar seals bore martial or religious emblems, the 2-rider horse, the Agnus Dei, or the patriarchal cross. This seal was none of those. And unlike formal ecclesiastical seals, it had no Latin inscription around the edge, no reference to a grand master or commandery. It was anonymous, intimate, personal. Scholars have speculated that it may have belonged to a smaller circle within the order, a kind of inner sanctum tasked with preserving certain documents. The idea of Templar suborders isn't new. Inquisitorial records mention fratres selecti, the chosen brothers, in whispered tones. One particularly obscure testimony references the book and the seal, a phrase the interrogators dismissed as metaphor. But what if it wasn't in the Tomar archives? A single line found in a 14th century ledger notes the purchase of 5 measures of red wax for use in scrolls of light. No further explanation is given, just an entry buried among more mundane records of wine grain and cloth. Scrolls of light. Not a standard inventory item, not an ecclesiastical term, but evocative and entirely consistent with references to the lost gospel in other parts of the investigation. If the gospel survived, it would not have traveled under its true name. It would have been disguised, fragmented, even rewritten in cipher, and sealed again and again, not just physically, but spiritually. To open the scroll was to cross a threshold. It required not just eyes, but understanding. One anecdote adds a layer of mystery. In 1913, a Portuguese collector named Duarte Lima claimed to have purchased a scroll in northern Spain, bearing a faint impression of the same dove and stars seal. The scroll, according to his letters, was written in mirror Latin, its sentences spiraling inward like a labyrinth. The content, he claimed, it was a gospel, but not one about events. Rather, he said, it speaks of what cannot be seen and what must be done to see it. Unfortunately, Lima died under unclear circumstances during the Spanish flu pandemic, and the scroll, if it ever existed, vanished into private hands. But his notes survive, and their language is eerily familiar to descriptions of Gnostic texts. The idea of a Gospel of the Dove has gained traction among esoteric historians, not because of hard evidence, but because of repeated patterns. The seal appears, the phrase recurs, and witnesses separated by time, place, and agenda all seem to recall something soft, elusive, luminous. Not a gospel of law or lineage, but of perception, of peace. There is even a folk legend in central France among the hills once guarded by Templar patrols. It speaks of the Whispering Scroll, a text that could only be read when held before a flame with the reader's breath warming the parchment. The story goes that those who read it lost the desire for power, that they wandered into silence, smiling never to return. It's a romantic tale, certainly, but it hints at something essential, that this gospel, whatever it was never meant to convert the masses. It was a key for the few. The seal then becomes more than a safeguard. It's a message. The dove descending is not merely symbolic of the Holy Spirit. It is an invitation. The spiral of stars is not just decoration, it is the path inward. And the single word beneath, whether light, voice, or peace, is less a title than a destination. Nothing of the parchment's contents has been recovered. The scroll it once sealed may have been burned hidden or still buried in a vault beneath some forgotten outpost. But the wax remains, hardened, whole, silent. And for those who seek, that silence is louder than any sermon. On Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, the Templar network was shattered. In France, they were rounded up before dawn, interrogated, tortured. But the order was never just French. It was pan-European, crossing borders, languages, and allegiances. And as papal orders reached further commanderies, a curious pattern emerged. In some regions, the arrests were swift. In others, the Templars simply vanished. No bodies, no trials, just dust and silence. It's in that silence where the trail of the gospel reappears, not through direct mention, but through sudden, unexplained shifts in ritual doctrine and manuscript circulation across Europe. Portugal, for instance, did not burn its Templars. King Dinis simply renamed them. The Order of Christ was born in 1319, a rebranding effort that allowed the Knights, and potentially their texts, to survive under a new banner. Within decades, the order became entwined with early Portuguese exploration. It was their cross, unchanged from the Templar sigil, that adorned the sails of Henry the Navigator's ships. And in the archives of Tomar, several illuminated manuscripts were copied using unusual symbology, echoing metaphors of inward light and sevenfold awakening. These phrases don't match any standard Catholic liturgy, but they closely resemble language found in Gnostic codices and oral Cathar traditions. Then there's Scotland. The Templars were never officially arrested there. In fact, local legends claim that ships from La Rochelle fled north just before the French cracked down docking near Argyll or Islay. Coincidentally or not, several Scottish churches from the early 14th century display iconography not found anywhere else in Europe, twin pillars, flanking a lone robed figure holding an open scroll. Some art historians call it allegorical, but the scroll is always blank, symbol of lost words, or of a text that must be known, not shown. In Rosslyn Chapel, built later by descendants of those connected to the Templar tradition, carvings depict an elaborate code of foliage stars and geometrical knots. Among them, a dove descending into a circle of flame. And in the crypt, there's a sealed chamber never opened, rumored, though never proven, to house relics and texts too dangerous for daylight. The St. Clair family, tied both to the Knights and later Freemasonry, maintained oral traditions about a great book of clarity, hidden to protect both the message and the world from misunderstanding it. Spain, too, offers threads. After the fall of Montségur and the eradication of the Cathars, many survivors disappeared into the northern hills. Some records suggest their writings, particularly scrolls, claimed to contain the original Testament, were smuggled into Templar strongholds. In the decades following the Templar suppression, certain Spanish confraternities began enacting mystery plays that diverged sharply from traditional gospel narratives. One, preserved in fragmentary form in the Toledo archives, features a silent Christ figure who teaches not by miracle, but by drawing symbols in sand. The crowd does not cheer. There is no crucifixion. The play ends with the phrase, "They remembered themselves." Even in the East, in remote monasteries along the edges of Cyprus and Crete, once key Templar ports, records from the late 14th century mention visitors described as Latin monks without vows who sought access to scrolls written in Coptic and Syriac. One abbot wrote in frustration, "They ask not for relics, only for the word unwritten." A strange phrase, but one that hints at a gospel that defied text. Perhaps not a book, but a mode of seeing. What emerges from this scattered map is a strange kind of migration, not of a people, but of an idea. The gospel, if it existed, did not remain intact. It scattered like ash in wind. One phrase here, a symbol there, a ritual remembered, a melody repeated, a seal pressed into soft wax. By the time it surfaces in Renaissance esoteric writings or in Enlightenment-era secret societies, it's no longer called a gospel. It's the light, the teaching, the mirror, the book of silence. And perhaps that's the point. If the Templars knew this text could never be protected in one place, they may have chosen dispersion over preservation. Better for the truth to echo than to be entombed. Safer to let it mutate so long as its essence survives. In a 17th century diary belonging to a Dutch mystic, there's a passage that reads, "In the west, it fell in the north, it waited in the east, it breathed, and in the south, it will rise." He attributes it to a secret teaching passed down from knights who never returned. Whether fiction or fact, it perfectly captures the paradox of the Templar gospel, always vanishing, always reappearing, and always one step beyond proof. Perhaps the real message was never meant to be owned, only encountered, glimpsed in silence and carried in fragments across time, not to convince the world, but to awaken a few. You've followed the clues, the scrolls that vanished, the frescoes that spoke without scripture, the whispered rites, the hidden symbols, the wax seals pressed by hands long turned to dust. And now, looking back across the centuries, a question no longer seems as outlandish as it did when we began. Did the Templars possess a gospel the Church tried to erase? And more dangerously, did they believe it? Here's what we know. The Templars had both motive and means. They had access to ancient sites, Jerusalem chief among them, where early Christian, Jewish, and even pagan texts were buried, reused, or deliberately concealed. They had contact with Eastern Christian sects and Islamic scholars, both of whom preserved radically different ideas about Jesus and divine knowledge. They also had the infrastructure, scribe monks, secure libraries, and encrypted archives to copy, protect, and conceal writings of profound importance. We know they were accused of heresy, but rarely of political ambition. What troubled their inquisitors most was theological. A refusal to venerate the cross, a rejection of standard confession, a belief in some inner truth only accessible through personal awakening. These were not the doctrines of power-hungry rebels. They were the marks of men following a gospel that taught differently. That gospel, based on every fragment traced in this long inquiry, seems to speak not of crucifixion, but of transformation. Not of salvation through suffering, but of clarity through understanding. The Christ within, not the Christ above. That vision to a church founded on hierarchical control was poison. So it buried the Templars, literally and metaphorically, publicly through trials and executions, silently through sealed archives, vanished manuscripts, and a rewriting of legacy. But the gospel did not die. The first burial was an attempt to destroy. The second, far quieter, was a choice. The Templars, or what remained of them, scattered the truth, rather than allow it to be annihilated. 1,000 pieces, 1,000 veils, hidden in plays, paintings, rituals, and whispered lines passed from master to initiate. And perhaps that's where it survives best, not as dogma, but as myth. A myth seated in stone and silence. One that can't be proven, but also won't disappear. The Church, in its effort to stamp out a rival gospel, ensured that its own story would never go uncontested. And the Templars, in their final act, may have chosen not to defend themselves, but to defend the one thing they believed mattered more, a message that could not be owned. Not by Rome, not by kings, not even by themselves. A gospel buried twice, once by power, once by love. So now the trail ends, not with certainty, not with revelation, but with a breath, a pause, and the rustle of parchment never turned. Somewhere perhaps the last copy still exists, sealed in wax, hidden in wood, or lost to fire long ago. But even without it, something remains. Not the words, but the weight of them. The echo, the shape left behind in silence. You imagine a dim chapel lit by candlelight, the scent of beeswax and cold stone, a cloaked figure reading not aloud, but inward, their lips unmoving, their eyes tracing lines written by another hand centuries earlier, and on the page, not miracles, not commands, but questions, gentle, disarming questions. Who told you you were broken? What if salvation is memory? What happens when you wake? You picture the scribe who copied it in secret, the knight who protected it across the sea, the initiate who read it once and never spoke of it again. Their names are gone. But the act, the sacred defiance of remembering, lives on. And in this moment, you carry it too. You won't hear trumpets. There are no relics to display. No gospel of the dove, no seal to break, no vault to descend. Just this, a lingering suspicion that the truth was softer, stranger, more human than we were taught. A Christ who looked inward and invited you to do the same. A message too quiet to survive in power, but too powerful to ever truly vanish. So close your eyes now. Let the candles burn low. Let the story slip gently out of focus. The words were never meant to be shouted. They were meant to be whispered and remembered, like a dream.